No one can see us. Now it's time for me to fulfill my duty.
Kel Voss adjusted his collar as he stood in the grand hall of the Zavarian High Court. The towering stone pillars gleamed under the golden light of floating orbs, casting eerie shadows across the crowd of warriors, nobles, and dignitaries. A deep drum echoed through the chamber, marking the start of the final treaty celebration between Earth and the Zavarian Empire. Kale, a seasoned diplomat, had attended his fair share of interstellar peace talks, but nothing had prepared him for this. The banquet had begun with a series of formal speeches, most of which Kale barely understood due to the poetic way Zavarians spoke. Their language was full of metaphors about war, honor, and survival, making it difficult for him to tell whether they were toasting friendship or future conquest. Still, he smiled, nodded, and followed the lead of his Zavarian host, Supreme Chancellor Vaylor. "Drink, Ambassador," the Chancellor had said, offering Kel a small obsidian cup filled with dark crimson liquid. Kel had hesitated. Alien customs could be unpredictable, but refusing hospitality was a diplomatic disaster waiting to happen. So he took the cup, raised it in a respectful toast, and downed the drink in one go. The room fell dead silent. Hundreds of piercing eyes locked onto him. Some warriors muttered under their breath. Others stared in shock. Kel felt the first wave of panic creep up his spine. Did I just insult them? Before he could ask what happened, the Chancellor's eyes gleamed with something dangerously close to amusement. "A bold move," Ambassador Vaylor said. "You have accepted the bonding rite." Kale blinked. The what now? The sound of heavy boots echoed behind him. He turned. Too late. A figure stepped forward, towering over him. Before Kel could react, a sharp voice whispered near his ear. "No one can see us now. It's time for me to fulfill my duty." Kel's instincts screamed at him to move, but before he could, his feet left the ground as he was swept off his feet, literally. The last thing he saw before his world turned upside down was the cheering crowd. Moments later, a very confused groom. Kel groaned as he pushed himself off the cold stone floor. His vision cleared just in time to see Xilara Vorzin, the infamous Divarian princess and undefeated war champion, standing over him. Her arms were crossed, her expression unreadable. The entire banquet hall watched in expectant silence. Kale cleared his throat. Did I just black out? Xilara's gaze didn't waver. "You accepted the bonding rite." Kale blinked again. "I don't even know what that is." Vaylor clapped a hand on Cal's shoulder, nearly knocking him forward. "A sacred warrior tradition. By drinking from the ceremonial cup, you prove yourself bold and worthy." Cal's stomach dropped. Worthy of what exactly? Xilara finally spoke again. "Me." A long pause followed. Kel ran a hand down his face. This has to be a misunderstanding. Maybe there was still a way out. "Wait," he said, holding up a hand. "Surely there's some sort of reversal process. Some loophole." Vaylor chuckled. "There is." Kale sighed in relief. "Oh, thank. You must defeat Xilara in battle." Cal's breath caught in his throat. He turned to Xilara. She was smirking. Kale swallowed hard. He was so doomed. Kale stood frozen in the center of the grand hall, his brain struggling to catch up with reality. Around him, hundreds of Zavarian warriors pounded their fists against their armored chests, chanting in a deep, rhythmic tone. Their eyes burned with excitement. The duel had been declared. Across the room, Xilara watched him with arms crossed, her smirk unwavering. She was calm, confident, and completely ready to destroy him. Kale took a slow breath. He had been in some ridiculous situations before, escaping an exploding space station, talking down a hostile alien king, even dodging an angry ex-girlfriend's flying shoe. But this was a new level of insanity. He raised a hand hesitantly. "Let's just wait a second. I'm a diplomat. I do negotiations. I don't do combat." Vaylor, the Supreme Chancellor, laughed. "Then you will lose quickly." Not helping. Kale looked back at Xilara. "You're not actually going to fight me, right? I mean, this is just a formality. A quick tap, and we move on." Xilara tilted her head. "If you surrender, You dishonor me. So that's a no. The chanting grew louder. A masked Zavarian warrior stepped forward, tossing something at Cal's feet. It was a training sword, made of some polished black metal. He picked it up, testing the weight. Too heavy, too solid, too real. Cal was going to die. The duel begins. A sharp chime rang through the air, the signal to fight. Zilara moved first. Cal barely saw it. A blur of motion, a shift in the air, and suddenly, she was in front of him. His instincts screamed. He ducked just as her strike sliced through the air where his head had been. Whoa! He scrambled backward, gripping his sword like it was a lifeline. The warriors roared in approval. Zilara didn't stop. She came at him again, her blade moving with deadly precision, each strike fast, controlled, and effortless. Cal, he was barely surviving. Block, dodge, pray, repeat. Metal clashed, sparks flew, and Cal's arms ached as he deflected her attacks. He wasn't winning. He was delaying the inevitable. But the longer he stayed standing, the louder the cheers grew. The Zavarian warriors weren't just watching. They were enjoying the fight. Cal gritted his teeth. Fine. If he was going to lose, he would lose smart. Cal's ridiculous plan. Instead of trying to fight Zilara's way, Cal switched to his own game. He sidestepped instead of blocking. He used quick footwork instead of brute strength. And when he saw an opening, he did something no Zavarian warrior would expect. He threw his sword. The blade spun through the air, completely missing Zilara, but she blinked, distracted for half a second. Cal took that second and ran. The crowd exploded in laughter as he dodged around the arena, weaving between pillars, rolling under obstacles, using anything he could to stay alive. Zilara chased him, her movements fluid and powerful, but Cal wasn't playing fair. He was dodging, flipping tables, grabbing fruit from the banquet, and throwing it at her. At one point, he grabbed a ceremonial flag and whipped it toward her like a matador. She stopped, eyes narrowing. Did you just challenge me with fabric? Cal grinned. Well, it slowed you down, didn't it? For the first time, Zilara laughed, and in that moment of distraction, Cal lunged. Not with a weapon, not with force, but with pure, reckless human audacity. He tackled her. A shocking outcome. The hall fell silent. Cal landed on top of Zilara, pinning her shoulders to the ground. They both froze. The warmth of her breath brushed against his cheek. Her heartbeat was steady, powerful, controlled. The Zavarian warriors stared. Cal swallowed hard. Did I win? Zilara looked up at him, her golden eyes sharp. Then she smirked. Interesting. A single chime rang through the air, signaling the end of the match. Valor stepped forward, his booming voice filling the chamber. The human has lasted against the warrior princess. He has proven his worth. The crowd roared in approval. Cal blinked. Wait, what? Zilara slowly sat up, her smirk never fading. You are clever, Cal Voss. He exhaled. So, I don't have to fight you again, right? She gave him a look. That depends on how our wedding night goes. Cal's brain short-circuited. What? Cal sat at the long banquet table, trying to process everything that had just happened. The duel, the ridiculous chase, the fact that he had technically won by sheer dumb luck. Now he was engaged to a warrior princess who was sitting right next to him. Zilara seemed completely at ease, sipping from a goblet filled with something deep blue and suspiciously glowing. Every now and then, she'd glance at him, her smirk returning as if she could read the confusion written all over his face. So, he finally spoke, pushing a plate of what looked like roasted tentacle away. We're really doing this. Zilara set down her goblet. Of course. Cal rubbed his temples. You don't even know me. You bested me in combat. I ran. Zilara chuckled. You survived. You adapted. And you amuse me. Cal narrowed his eyes. That last part worries me. Before he could argue more, Valor, the Supreme Chancellor, stood and raised his arms. The hall fell silent. The ritual is complete. The human stands as Zilara's chosen mate. This union will bring honor to both our worlds. The warriors cheered, pounding the table in approval. Kale forced a smile and muttered, "No pressure. A royal problem." Just as Cal was considering making a very quick exit, the massive doors at the end of the hall slammed open. A new figure strode inside. Tall, broad-shouldered, and wrapped in ornate black armor, the man carried an air of pure arrogance. His golden eyes burned with rage as they locked onto Kale. Kale knew that look. He'd seen it in countless bars, right before some guy threw a punch over a misunderstanding. Great, another problem. The hall tensed as the newcomer stopped just short of the banquet table. His voice was like thunder. "This is a mistake." Vaylor's expression hardened. "General Varric, you will watch your tongue." Kale internally groaned. Of course, this guy had a name that screamed trouble. Varric turned to Cilara. "You cannot be serious about this, Cilara. A human." He said the word like it was something disgusting. Cilara didn't flinch. "He is my choice." Varric's jaw clenched. "You were meant for a warrior of Zavarian blood, a man who could lead armies beside you." Kale sighed. "Hey, I might not be a warrior, but I'm pretty good at talking my way out of getting shot." Cilara smirked at that. "But Varric?" His expression darkened. "This is an insult to our traditions." Kale leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "All right, look. I don't know what's going on between you two, but I have a feeling you don't like me." Varric's fist slammed against the table, rattling plates. "You do not deserve to stand at her side." Kale blinked. "Wow, tell me how you really feel." Cilara's voice was ice. "Enough, Varric." But Cal could already see where this was going. Zyvarian culture was all about strength, and guys like Varric, they didn't back down. Varric exhaled sharply, then straightened. "If you truly wish to prove yourself, human," he took a step forward, gaze locked on Kale. "Face me in a challenge." "Oh, for the love off." Kale leaned back in his chair. "Didn't I just do one of those?" Varric's smirk was anything but friendly. "That was a game. This is real." The hall murmured with excitement. Another challenge. This was entertaining to them. Kale pinched the bridge of his nose. "Okay, let's say I don't accept." Varric's smirk widened. "Then you are a coward, and unworthy of her." Kale glanced at Cilara. She was watching him, expression unreadable. He exhaled. Of course, it comes down to this." Varric crossed his arms. "Well, human, will you stand and fight, or admit you are nothing?" Kale drummed his fingers against the table, pretending to think. Then he smiled. "What are the rules?" Varric frowned. "Rules?" Kale shrugged. "Yeah, what's the challenge? Swords? Fists? Arm wrestling?" He paused. "A cooking competition." A few warriors chuckled. Varric did not. "This is no joke." Kale raised a hand. "I get that, but I need to know what kind of humiliation I'm walking into." Varric's eyes gleamed. "A trial of survival. You will be taken to the Outlands, where you must endure the trials of the wild. If you survive, I will accept your place at Cilara's side." Kale blinked. "Survive. That's it." Varric smirked. "Survive 5 days. No weapons. No assistance." The hall erupted in approval. Kale resisted the urge to bang his head against the table. Cilara spoke, her voice firm. "This is unnecessary." Varric's smirk didn't fade, then let him refuse. Kale rubbed his face. "You people really don't believe in peaceful conversations, do you?" Cilara turned to him. "You do not have to do this, Kale." He hesitated. Every instinct told him to say no. He was a diplomat, not a survivalist, but he could see it, the way the warriors looked at him. If he backed down now, they would never take him seriously. He exhaled. 5 days? No weapons. Kale stood at the edge of the Outlands, staring at the vast, untamed wilderness before him. Jagged cliffs stretched into the sky, strange glowing plants pulsed with eerie light, and distant howls echoed through the air. This place was nothing like Earth. It was a land designed to break people. Behind him, a group of warriors watched in anticipation. Some whispered bets on how long he'd last. Others just grinned, expecting his quick demise. Varric stood nearby, arms crossed, smirking. Last chance, human. Walk away now, and no one will think less of you. Kale snorted. That's a lie, and we both know it. Varric chuckled. True, but at least you'd be alive. Kale ignored him. His gaze flicked to Silara, standing on a high stone platform, watching in silence. She hadn't spoken much since he agreed to this madness, but he could tell she wasn't happy about it. With a deep breath, Kale stepped forward. The trial had begun. Survival begins. The moment he entered the outlands, the warriors behind him disappeared from view. The dense jungle swallowed the light, and the air grew thick with a strange electric energy. He had no weapons, no supplies, just his wits. He moved carefully, avoiding the twisted roots and glowing fungi. He'd read enough survival manuals to know that the weirdest-looking stuff was usually the most dangerous. A rustling sound caught his ear. Kale froze. Something large was moving through the trees. Slowly, he backed away, stepping behind a thick trunk. His heart pounded. A shadow moved in the underbrush, massive and silent. Whatever it was hunting. Kale grabbed a loose branch, a terrible weapon, but better than nothing. The creature emerged from the foliage. It was massive, covered in dark, spiked scales, with glowing green eyes that locked onto him instantly. Kale exhaled. Oh, great. The beast lunged. Kale dove sideways, barely avoiding the giant claws that ripped through the air where he had just stood. He scrambled up and ran, leaping over roots and dodging branches. The creature was fast, too fast. Kale spotted a thick vine hanging from a tree. Not his best idea, but definitely his only one. As the beast lunged again, Kale grabbed the vine and swung hard, narrowly escaping the monster's snapping jaws. He landed on a ledge, rolling to absorb the impact. The creature snarled below, its glowing eyes locked onto him. But it didn't climb. It simply stared for a long moment, then vanished back into the jungle. Kale lay on his back, breathing hard. Day 1. Not dead yet. A midnight visitor. By nightfall, Kale had found shelter in a hollowed-out tree, its interior wide enough to keep him hidden. He had gathered some edible-looking fruit, though he was pretty sure one of them was staring at him. The jungle at night was worse. Unnatural sounds whispered through the air, shadows shifted when they shouldn't, and the temperature dropped suddenly. Kale tried to sleep, but something felt off. A presence. He opened his eyes. Silara stood at the entrance of his hiding spot. Kale blinked. Either I'm hallucinating, or you're really here. Silara stepped inside, her face unreadable. You should not have agreed to this. Kale sat up. Little late for that. She studied him for a moment, then reached into her cloak and tossed something toward him. A small curved dagger. Kale caught it. I thought this was supposed to be no weapons. Silara's gaze darkened. Varric does not play fair. You will need it. Kale gripped the dagger. You're not supposed to help me, are you? Silara's lips curved slightly. You are my chosen mate. If you die, it would be inconvenient. Kale smirked. Inconvenient? That's the word we're going with. She didn't answer. Instead, she turned toward the entrance. Survive, Kale. And just like that, she was gone. Kale stared at the dagger in his hand. The game had just changed. Kale tightened his grip on the dagger Silara had given him. Its blade was curved, light, and perfectly balanced, clearly designed for speed and precision. He traced his fingers over the strange markings on the handle, wondering if they held some deeper meaning. He sat in the hollowed tree for a moment, listening. The jungle around him pulsed with unseen life. He could hear distant growls, the rustling of massive creatures moving through the underbrush, and something else, a sound too soft for any predator to make. Footsteps. Kale's muscles tensed. He wasn't alone. Silently, he slipped out of his hiding spot, pressing himself against the rough bark of a nearby tree. The moonlight filtered through the strange, twisted canopy above, casting flickering shadows over the jungle floor. A figure moved through the darkness, not a beast, a person. Kale recognized the silhouette immediately. Varric. The alien warrior moved with quiet precision, his sharp eyes scanning the trees. He was hunting. And Kale was the prey. Kel exhaled slowly. So Silara was right. This trial wasn't fair. The deadly game. Varric stopped, his head tilting slightly. You think I don't know you're there, human? Kale stayed silent, pressing himself deeper into the shadows. He needed an advantage. Varric smirked. You are bold, I'll give you that, but you do not belong here. You are not one of us. Kale clenched his jaw. He'd heard those words before, from people who underestimated him. Varric took another step forward, his blade gleaming under the moonlight. Come out. Face me. Prove you are worthy. Cal's mind raced. If he fought head-on, he'd lose. Varric was stronger, faster, and had years of combat training. But Cal had something else, his mind. He looked up. The trees. That could work. Cal moved fast, grabbing a thick vine and pulling himself up into the canopy. His movements were quick, quiet. Varric didn't see him go. The warrior's eyes narrowed. Coward. Cal smirked. Not coward, just smart. And then he struck. Using the vine, Cal swung down, landing behind Varric. Before the warrior could react, Cal kicked the back of his knee, sending him stumbling forward. Varric snarled, spinning, but Cal was already moving. He ducked under a wild swing and slashed at Varric's wrist with the dagger. Not deep, just enough to make him drop his weapon. The blade clattered to the ground. Cal pointed his own dagger at Varric's throat. For a moment, neither of them moved. The jungle fell silent. Then, slowly, Varric grinned. You fight like a beast backed into a corner. He chuckled. I respect that. Cal arched an eyebrow. Then you'll let me finish this trial. Varric's grin widened. Oh no, you still have much to prove. But now, I am curious to see how far you will go. He stepped back, retrieved his weapon, and disappeared into the jungle, leaving Cal alone. Cal exhaled. He had won this round, but the game was far from over. A moment of peace. Later that night, Cal found himself sitting by a small hidden spring, washing the dirt and sweat from his face. His hands still trembled slightly from the fight. Footsteps approached. This time, he didn't react with panic. He already knew who it was. Zilara. She sat beside him without a word. For a while, they just listened to the sound of water trickling over smooth stones. Finally, she spoke. You are reckless. Cal smiled tiredly. I'm still alive. Zilara sighed. For now. She reached into her cloak and pulled out something small, a silver pendant, shaped like a crescent moon. Without explanation, she placed it in his palm. Cal frowned. What's this? Zilara hesitated, then looked away. A warrior's charm. It is given to one who. She stopped. Who should not die so easily. Cal studied her face. There was something unspoken in her words, something deeper than simple concern. His fingers closed around the pendant. For the first time since this madness began, he felt like he wasn't fighting alone. Cal awoke to the sound of distant drums, a slow rhythmic pounding that sent vibrations through the earth. He sat up, rubbing his eyes. The jungle around him was bathed in soft morning light, but there was nothing peaceful about the day ahead. Zilara stood nearby, her arms crossed as she watched the horizon. She hadn't slept. Cal pushed himself to his feet. That's the sound of the next trial, isn't it? Zilara nodded. The path of fire. Cal exhaled, stretching his sore muscles. And let me guess, it's not as simple as walking through a few flames. Zilara's expression remained unreadable. No, you will not face fire. You will face them. She pointed toward the towering stone cliffs in the distance. At the base, dozens of warriors had gathered, their armor gleaming under the morning sun. A brutal gauntlet awaited him. Trial of the clan. By the time Cal arrived, a crowd had formed. Warriors stood in a circle, watching as he stepped forward. Some looked at him with curiosity, others with barely concealed disdain. A tall elder with deep scars across his face raised his hand, silencing the murmurs. The human has come to prove himself. His voice was deep, commanding. He will walk the path of fire. Cal squared his shoulders. All right, what's the challenge? The elder smirked. You must reach the other side, if you can. Kale followed the elder's gaze. Across the field, past the towering rock formations, stood a high platform. Easy, except for the warrior standing in his way. Silara stepped closer, lowering her voice. "They will not kill you, but they will break you if they can." Kale cracked his knuckles. "Good thing I don't break easy." The elder raised his hand again. "Begin." The first warrior rushed forward, fast as a striking snake. Kale barely dodged in time, twisting to the side as the warrior's blade cut through the air. He countered with a quick elbow to the ribs, forcing his opponent back. The second came from behind. Kale ducked, grabbing the attacker's arm and flipping him over his shoulder. The crowd roared with approval. But more were coming. Kale fought with everything he had, dodging, countering, using their strength against them. He wasn't as strong as they were, but he was fast. Smart. A third warrior aimed a sweeping kick at Cal's legs. He leaped over it, using the warrior's own momentum to shove him into the dirt. Then, suddenly, pain. A fist slammed into his side, knocking the air from his lungs. Cal stumbled but refused to go down. Not yet. Another hit followed, and then another. His vision blurred for a moment, but he gritted his teeth. He wouldn't lose. Somewhere in the chaos, he heard a voice. Silara's voice. "Stand up, Kale." And he did. With a final burst of energy, Kale sprinted forward, dodging the last attacker and diving toward the platform. His hand slammed against the rough stone as he pulled himself up. The crowd fell silent. Then, the elder raised his hand once more. "He has passed." A warrior's recognition. Kale sat on the edge of the platform, catching his breath. His whole body ached, but he couldn't help but grin. He had done it. Silara approached, her expression unreadable. Then, without warning, she reached out and lightly pressed her fingers against his forehead. Kale blinked. What was that? Silara hesitated. "It is recognition." Kale tilted his head. "So, like a warrior's handshake?" Silara sighed. "Something like that." Kale chuckled, rubbing his sore ribs. "Well, next time, maybe just a handshake." Silara shook her head, but he caught the hint of a smile. For the first time, he wasn't just an outsider. He was one step closer to being part of something more. Kale sat by the fire, his muscles still aching from the trial. The warriors who had tried to stop him now sat around the flames, speaking in low voices, occasionally glancing at him with newfound respect. He was no longer just the human. He had proven himself, but Kale knew the real challenge wasn't over yet. Across the fire, Silara sat quietly, sharpening a curved blade. She hadn't said much since the trial ended, but Kale could feel a shift between them. Before, she had looked at him as an outsider, a problem to be dealt with. Now, her gaze held something different. He wasn't sure if that was a good thing or a bad thing. Kale stretched his sore arms and let out a sigh. "So, do I get a trophy for that, or is almost getting my ribs broken the prize?" One of the warriors chuckled, shaking his head. "The prize is that you are still breathing, human." Silara smirked. "You should be honored. Many do not make it past the path of fire." Kale rolled his eyes. "Great, I'll put that on my resume." The warriors laughed, and Kale was surprised to find that even Silara looked amused. It was the first time he had truly felt accepted here, but the moment didn't last long. The sound of a deep horn echoed through the night air, and suddenly, the mood shifted. The warriors stood up immediately, grabbing their weapons. Kale followed suit, glancing at Silara. Is that a good sound or a bad sound?" Silara's expression darkened. "It means we are not alone." A shadow in the night. The jungle was alive with movement. Kale followed Silara and the others as they moved quickly through the trees, their steps silent despite their heavy armor. Whatever had set off the alarm, it wasn't friendly. They reached the edge of a clearing, where two guards stood over something lying on the ground. Kale peered over Silara's shoulder. It was a scout, one of their own. He was wounded, his armor cracked, his breathing shallow. Silara knelt beside him. Who did this? The scout's eyes fluttered open. He struggled to speak, but finally, one word escaped his lips. Vornik. A hush fell over the warriors. Kale didn't recognize the name, but the way everyone reacted told him everything he needed to know. "They are close," one of the warriors muttered. Kale frowned. "Okay, someone want to fill me in? What's a Vornik?" Sci-Fi stood, gripping her blade tightly. "A rival clan. No honor, no mercy. If they are here, they are hunting." Kale swallowed hard. "Hunting what?" Sci-Fi's eyes met his. "Us." The fight begins. A rustling sound came from the trees. Kale barely had time to react before something huge and fast lunged out of the shadows. He dove to the ground as a warrior-sized figure clad in dark armor landed where he had just been standing. The Vornik warrior let out a deep, guttural growl before swinging a massive axe toward Kale. Too fast. Kale twisted his body at the last second, the blade missing him by inches. "I really hate this planet." The battle erupted in an instant. Warriors clashed in a violent flurry of steel and energy weapons. Kale rolled to his feet just as another Vornik charged at him. No time to think. Just move. He grabbed a fallen spear, dodging a wild swing, then drove the blunt end into the Vornik's stomach. The enemy staggered, giving Kale just enough time to knock him back with a hard kick. Sci-Fi fought nearby, moving with deadly precision. Every strike was calculated, every movement effortless. She was unstoppable. Kale had to admit it was impressive. But he didn't have time to admire her skills. Another Vornik rushed at him, and Kale barely managed to dodge the attack. He was running out of stamina fast. Then, out of nowhere, a sharp whistle cut through the night. The Vornik warriors hesitated for just a moment before retreating into the shadows. It was over. For now. A moment of truth. Kale leaned against a tree, catching his breath. "Tell me that was just a one-time thing." Sci-Fi shook her head. "No, they will be back." Kale groaned. "Of course they will." She stepped closer, her voice softer now. "You fought well." Kale raised an eyebrow. "Wait, was that a compliment?" Sci-Fi hesitated before nodding. "Yes." Kale smirked. "I think that's the nicest thing you've ever said to me." Sci-Fi rolled her eyes but didn't deny it. For the first time since arriving here, Kale realized something. He wasn't just fighting to survive anymore. He was fighting for something bigger, something that mattered. And for the first time, he didn't feel alone. The jungle was silent, too silent. Kale stood with his back against a thick tree, gripping the hilt of a short blade he had picked up from one of the fallen warriors. His breath was steady, but his heart pounded like a war drum. The Vornik had retreated, but they weren't gone. Sci-Fi crouched beside him, scanning the darkened treetops. She was tense, focused. It was the first time Kale had seen her look, uncertain. "They're waiting," she whispered. Kale exhaled slowly. "Waiting for what?" She turned her gaze toward him, her expression unreadable. "For us to make a mistake." A desperate plan. The warriors gathered in a tight circle. Their leader, a battle-scarred warrior named Varen, spoke in a low, grave voice. "We cannot outrun them. The Vornik will strike before sunrise." He turned to Sci-Fi. "You know what must be done." Kale frowned. "Hold on. Why do I feel like I'm not going to like this plan?" Sci-Fi's jaw tightened. The Vornik are strong, but they rely on numbers and ambush tactics. If we strike first, we take away their advantage. Kale rubbed his face. "So we're going straight at the murder squad in the dark?" "Great. Love it. Fantastic idea." Varen ignored his sarcasm. "You are not of this world, human. You are not their target. You can leave." Kale looked at Sci-Fi. She said nothing. And that silence told him everything. He clenched his fists. "Yeah, not happening." Sci-Fi gave him a sharp look. "Kale. No, you don't get to push me away now. I'm in this, whether you like it or not." A long pause. Then, to his surprise, Sci-Fi nodded. Into the fray. The attack began before dawn. Kale moved through the underbrush with Sci-Fi at his side, his grip firm on the stolen blade. The warriors spread out, flanking the Vornik camp in silence. The enemy hadn't noticed them yet. A signal came, a short, sharp whistle. Then, chaos. The warriors stormed forward, their weapons cutting through the Vornik lines. Kale ducked as an enemy blade slashed inches from his face. too close. He lashed out, knocking the Vornik off balance before Zilara finished him with a clean strike. She glanced at Cal. Stay close. He already was. They fought side by side, moving like they had trained together for years. Cal covered Zilara's blind spots. She cleared the path ahead. Somewhere in the chaos, he forgot about fear. But then, a roar. A massive Vornik warrior, taller than the others, stepped into the clearing. His armor was thicker, his weapons deadlier. He locked eyes with Kale and Zilara. Zilara tensed. The warlord. Kale gritted his teeth. Of course there's a warlord. The Vornik leader lunged. The breaking point. The fight was brutal. The warlord was fast, too fast. Every strike forced Kale and Zilara backward. They couldn't keep up. Kale barely dodged a crushing blow, stumbling as pain flared in his side. He wasn't going to last much longer. Then he saw it. An opening. Zilara distracted the warlord for half a second, but that was all Kale needed. He moved. With a surge of adrenaline, he plunged his blade deep into the warlord's side. The Vornik froze. Then he fell. The battle was over. A new beginning. The sun rose over the battlefield. The Vornik were defeated. Kale sat on a fallen log, exhausted but alive. He had survived. Zilara approached, watching him carefully. You are not like the others. Kale smirked. I get that a lot. She hesitated, then extended her hand, an unspoken bond. Kale took it, and for the first time since crashing on this world, he knew he was exactly where he was meant to be.